In the misty mornings following a medieval battle, when the sun barely pierced a sky shrouded in gray clouds heavy with omens and dampness, the battlefield transformed into a canvas of desolation, suffering, and human endurance stretched to the limits of the impossible. The ground, soaked with mud mixed with blood, crunched under the faltering steps of the few still able to move, while reddish puddles, like shattered mirrors, reflected a dull sky speckled with circling ravens, patiently waiting for their moment to descend. The air was thick, laden with a stench that wove together the metallic tang of coagulated blood, the rancid sweat of exhausted men, the dung of horses, the burnt leather of fire-damaged armor, the acrid smoke of extinguished pyres, and the nascent reek of bodies beginning to rot under the open sky. Whether beneath a scorching sun that baked the flesh, a torrential rain that turned the terrain into a quagmire, or an icy wind that cut like an invisible blade. The groans of the wounded, broken, harrowing, sometimes barely a whisper, mingled with the cawing of ravens, the distant howls of wolves in forested regions, the buzzing of flies swarming over open wounds, and the occasional barking of wild dogs sniffing through the remains, drawn by the scent of death. Medieval soldiers, hardened men weighed down by iron or steel armor that could reach 20, 30, or even 40 kilos, wielding notched swords after hours of combat, splintered lances, dented shields, and enduring the brutality of hand-to-hand fighting, did not always find the glory sung by troubadours or a swift death in the heat of battle. For those who survived with wounds, deep sword slashes that left flesh hanging in tatters, arrows embedded in muscle, organs, or bone, fractures from maces that shattered bones like firewood, limbs crushed by horses' hooves, burns from boiling oil, pitch, or fire during a siege, crossbow bolts that pierced chainmail and plate armor as if they were cloth, or injuries from improvised weapons like clubs, sickles, stones, pitchforks, or even the fists of a desperate enemy, the path forward was a crucible of unbearable pain, uncertainty, and with a flicker of luck or divine will, a glimpse of humanity in a world where a man's life was worth less than good loot, a sturdy horse, a well-forged sword, a decorated helm, or a handful of silver, copper, or brass coins. War in the Middle Ages was not merely a clash of steel against steel. It was a whirlwind of violence where survival hinged on skill with a sword, strength to wield an axe or mace, endurance to bear armor under a scorching sun, torrential rain, bone-numbing cold, or throat-drying wind, and above all, a colossal dose of luck that determined whether an arrow grazed the head or pierced the chest, whether a mace blow fractured a bone or merely left a bruise, or whether a runaway horse trampled a comrade instead of oneself. When the din of battle faded, the war cries, the neighing of horses, the clang of swords, the whistle of arrows, and the creak of armor replaced by a silence broken only by moans, the crunch of earth underfoot, the drip of blood into the mud, and the hum of flies, the victors first turned to looting the fallen, collecting swords, shields, helms, chainmail, armor plates, daggers, knives, rings, buckles, belts, worn but usable boots, tattered cloaks, amulets, coins, scraps of banners, or anything that could be sold at a market or reused in the next battle. The wounded, both allies and enemies, were often relegated to the background, frequently abandoned on the field, lying amid pools of blood, fragments of broken armor, snapped lance shafts, trampled banners, overturned carts, dead horses, and the chaos of a war-ravaged landscape. Some, with the little strength they had left, tried to crawl to safety, a tree offering shade, a ditch to hide from cold, rain, looters, or scavenging animals, a stream to wash their wounds or drink murky water, or, if fortune favored them, their army's camp, if they could navigate through pain, confusion, fog, smoke from fires, or the darkness of night. But many, weakened by blood loss, shock, fractures that immobilized them, internal injuries that consumed them from within, or sheer exhaustion that snuffed out the will to fight, succumbed to fatigue, left at the mercy of the freezing night, looters who roamed the field like human vultures stripping the living and dead alike, or animals, ravens, wild dogs, wolves, boars, even bears in mountainous regions, that soon arrived, drawn by the smell of blood, exposed flesh, and death. The first obstacle for a wounded soldier was surviving the hours immediately following the battle. Open wounds, whether superficial cuts from a sword or dagger, deep gashes from an axe that sliced through muscle and bone, perforations from a lance that pierced the torso, crossbow wounds that could penetrate chainmail, a helm, or a plate of armor, burns from boiling oil, pitch, fire, or even sulfur used in sieges, or injuries from improvised weapons like clubs, stones, or agricultural tools, were an open invitation to infection. In an era without antibiotics or knowledge of germs, a cut we might consider minor today could become a death sentence within days or even hours, as bacteria multiplied in exposed flesh, exacerbated by mud, dust, dirt, flies laying eggs in wounds, sweat, dried blood, or fragments of clothing and armor embedded in the skin. Blood loss drove many to the brink of shock, a phenomenon medieval physicians did not understand as such but observed in soldiers who fainted, fell into a deep lethargy, shivered uncontrollably, sweated coldly, or simply seemed to fade away, with vacant stares, trembling bodies, waxen skin, a pulse faint as a whisper, and labored breathing. Those who could move did so with a mix of instinct, desperation, and sheer willpower, crawling with nails and teeth, using broken swords, splintered lances, dented shields, or branches as crutches, toward a place where they might find help. Though every step with a broken leg, every movement with a shattered arm, an embedded arrow, a burn that blazed like living fire, or a fractured bone grinding against nerves was an agony that tested the limits of human endurance. It was not uncommon for a soldier, attempting to escape, to collapse from exhaustion, die of cold in the night, dehydration under the scorching sun, starvation after days without food, or be finished off by looters who made no distinction between the living and the dead while searching for anything they could sell, use, or keep: a notched knife, a tattered boot, a broken buckle, a brass ring, a torn cloak, or even a lock of hair to sell as an amulet. In the camps, medical care was as improvised as it was brutal, a reflection of the era's harshness and the desperation to save lives with scarce resources and limited knowledge. Those tasked with treating the wounded were, in most cases, barber-surgeons, men whose expertise was limited to cutting hair, shaving beards, pulling teeth, stitching minor cuts, or, if lucky, having observed an operation in a monastery, city, castle, or under the tutelage of another equally inexperienced surgeon. These doctors arrived with kits more suited to a carpenter, blacksmith, or butcher than a healer: hand saws with worn teeth, broad-bladed knives, rusty tongs, crude scalpels, hooks for extracting arrows, probes for exploring deep wounds, curved needles for sewing, pincers for removing bone or metal fragments, and, if fortune smiled, a flask of sour wine, stale beer, brandy, vinegar, or even urine to use as an improvised disinfectant or to dull the patient's pain, though often the alcohol was so scarce it was reserved for commanders, nobles, clerics, or the surgeons themselves, who drank it to steady their nerves after hours of cutting, sawing, and stitching. Medieval surgery was a crude art where speed mattered more than precision, and survival depended as much on the surgeon's skill as on the patient's resilience. If an arm or leg was too mangled, perhaps with exposed bone, flesh torn to shreds, crushed by a mace blow, shattered by a cavalry charge, burned to the bone, or pierced by a lance, amputation was the most straightforward, though not always effective, solution. Picture a soldier, sweaty, pale as wax, breathing heavily, biting down on a piece of leather, a stick, a rag, a belt, or even his own fingers as the surgeon sawed through his limb with a blade that wasn't always clean, leaving a stump that, with luck, was cauterized with a red-hot iron, a torch, boiling oil, or hot resin to stop the bleeding, or stitched with linen, wool, horsehair, or animal gut threads, causing pain so intense that many fainted, screamed until voiceless, or died of shock before the procedure was complete. The screams must have echoed through the camp, reverberating among tattered canvas tents, overturned carts, smoldering fires, the neighing of horses, and the moans of other wounded, creating a symphony of suffering that left no one, not even the most hardened soldiers, unmoved. The survival rate for these operations was dishearteningly low, likely less than 20% in the most severe cases, and those who survived the saw often faced a life of disability in a society with little place for the maimed, condemned to beg at church doors, rely on family charity, perform menial tasks like guarding a gate or cleaning dung, or wander as outlaws in forests, mountains, or cities. And if you want to learn more about this topic, I've linked a book in the description that dives deeper. Hygiene, or rather its absence, was as deadly an enemy as any sword, lance, crossbow, mace, or arrow. Knowledge of germs was non-existent, and wounds were cleaned with water from nearby streams, rivers, or wells, often contaminated with dung, human waste, blood, animal remains, mud, or even poison from decomposing bodies. At best, diluted wine, stale beer, vinegar, urine, or makeshift saline solutions were used, offering a slight antiseptic effect but also potentially introducing more dirt if not properly filtered. Some surgeons applied homemade ointments made from honey, which had natural antibacterial properties, crushed herbs like yarrow, known for stopping bleeding, comfrey, used for fractures due to its supposed regenerative properties, rosemary, chamomile, nettle, dandelion, garlic, ivy, valerian, angelica, elderberry, basil, thyme, bay laurel, mint, parsley, moss, wild plant roots, or even spider webs, which, though it sounds absurd, could trap dirt and, in some cases, have an antibacterial effect due to the properties of spider silk. Others used animal fat, beeswax, pine resin, tree sap, or dried dung, believed to seal wounds, though these often introduced more bacteria. These remedies were a gamble. They could either save a life or hasten gangrene, that putrid infection that devoured flesh, turned skin black, caused devastating fevers, swelling, foul-smelling pus, and an odor so unbearable that even the most experienced surgeons recoiled. Fever, inflammation, septicemia, and gangrene were so common that many soldiers, though surviving the initial trauma, died days, weeks, or even months later, consumed by infections no one knew how to fight, their bodies trembling, skin burning, breath fetid, and minds clouded by delirium. Medical texts of the time, such as those by Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna, Al-Razi, Al-Zarawi, Ibn al-Baytar, or Byzantine treatises by Oribasius and Paul of Aegina, translated from Greek, Arabic, or Persian into Latin at schools like Toledo, Salerno, Cordoba, Constantinople, or Baghdad, offered theories about the body's humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, believed to need balance for health. But these ideas were more philosophical than practical, and battlefield surgeons, many of whom were illiterate or semi-literate, had no access to these texts and relied on experience, intuition, oral tradition, and often superstition, such as applying an ointment under a full moon to enhance its efficacy, avoiding wound treatment on cursed days per astrology, like Fridays or during an eclipse, reciting specific prayers while stitching to ward off evil spirits, causing infections, or even sacrificing an animal like a chicken or lamb to appease gods or saints. Social and military hierarchy played a crucial role in who received care and who was left to fate. A knight, noble, high-ranking cleric, or commander had far greater chances of being rescued and treated than a mere foot soldier, whose life was worth little in the grand scheme of war, often less than a horse, a suit of armor, or a banner. Nobles had servants, squires, pages, or even personal physicians who carried them to well-equipped tents with straw beds, wool blankets, furs, braziers for warmth, clean water, decent food, and perhaps exotic herbs or remedies brought from distant lands. Some were transported to monasteries, castles, cities, or even royal courts, where they received care that, while not much more advanced than that of barbers, was at least provided in a cleaner, warmer, and safer environment. Wealthy nobles traveled with apothecaries carrying rare herbs like saffron, myrrh, cloves, frankincense, aloe, cumin, cinnamon, ginger, or pepper, and remedies that, though expensive, were not always effective, often based on alchemical, religious, astrological beliefs, or the prestige of exotic ingredients imported from Persia, India, Egypt, China, or the Silk Roads. Common soldiers, however, relied on the goodwill of comrades, who sometimes risked their lives to drag them from the field, facing arrows, swords, looters, animals, or exhaustion to carry a wounded man across rugged terrain. Dense forests, swamps, muddy plains, scorching deserts, or snow-covered mountains. They also depended on the charity of monks, clerics, villagers, local women, or religious orders like the Hospitallers, Templars, Knights of St. Lazarus, or monks from monasteries like Cluny, Citeaux, or Monte Cassino, known for their efforts to care for the wounded, especially during the Crusades, feudal wars, or the Reconquista. But their priority was their own knights, clerics, pilgrims, or allies, not the recruited peasant, nameless mercenary, or militiaman who had lost an arm, leg, eye, or hope defending a cause they barely understood, whether it was the glory of a king, the conquest of a distant fief, the defense of a besieged city, the fight for the Holy Land, the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula, or the protection of a sacred relic. Religion permeated every aspect of medieval life, and the wounded were no exception. Many saw their injuries as divine punishment for sins committed. Lust, greed, wrath, envy, sloth, gluttony, pride, or even doubting the faith, swearing in vain, stealing food, or killing a man in battle. A test of faith imposed by God to purify the soul, or an opportunity for redemption through suffering, believed to bring one closer to Christ, who suffered on the cross. Monks, priests, and clerics accompanying armies not only offered spiritual comfort, administering last rites, confessions, blessings, or masses, but were often the only ones with any medical knowledge, gleaned from monastery scriptoria, cathedral schools like Chartres, Paris, Bologna, or Salerno, or texts by Avicenna, Hippocrates, Galen, Al-Razi, Al-Zarawi, or Abasius, Paul of Aegina, or Arabic, Byzantine, and Persian treatises translated into Latin. Monastic hospitals, emerging in Europe, especially in regions like Italy, France, southern Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, pilgrimage routes like the Camino de Santiago, or crusader cities like Antioch, Acre, or Jerusalem, were refuges for the wounded who managed to reach them, often after days, weeks, or even months of travel in rattling carts, on horseback, limping, crawling, or carried by comrades, enduring pain that defied human endurance, hunger, thirst, cold, heat, infections, bandits, wild animals, or enemies who might finish them off along the way. However, these hospitals focused more on palliative care than active healing. A soldier with a severe wound could spend weeks, months, or even years on a bed of straw, wood, or leather, receiving prayers, watery broth, stale bread, gruel, bitter herbal infusions, infrequently changed bandages, and, at best, the attention of a monk or nun with basic knowledge of herbs or surgery. Death was a constant companion, and many wounded, sensing it near, asked to confess, receive last rites, make a vow of pilgrimage, or donate their few possessions to the church, hoping to at least save their soul if their body was beyond saving. Some believed a healed wound was a direct miracle from God or a saint, like Saint Sebastian, patron of archers, Sts Cosmas and Damian, patrons of physicians, Saint Margaret, Saint Roch, patron of the sick, Saint Christopher, or Saint George, and it was not uncommon for survivors to vow pilgrimages to shrines like Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, Rome, Cologne, Aachen, Jerusalem, or the monastery of San Juan de Ortega, dragging their battered bodies through dusty, muddy, bandit-infested snow, blocked, sun-scorched, flood-soaked, or war-torn roads to give thanks for their survival, fulfill a vow, or seek absolution for their sins. If you're enjoying this topic and want more fascinating stories about the Middle Ages, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hit the button and join the community to catch every detail of these narratives. The most common battlefield injuries were cuts, perforations, fractures, burns, bruises, and internal injuries, each with its own horrors and challenges. Swords, daggers, axes, halberds, and knives left deep gashes that, if they didn't sever a major artery, could heal with time, provided the wound stayed clean. Nearly impossible in a muddy camp where potable water was a luxury. Mud clung to skin, bandages, wounds, and armor like a second skin. Flies laid eggs in exposed flesh, and sweat or dried blood irritated the skin. Arrows were a particularly cruel problem. Their tips, designed with barbs, hooks, diamond-shaped points, or even poisoned in some cases, could lodge in muscles, organs, bones, joints, or even the skull, making removal a delicate, brutal, and often fatal task. Surgeons used fine-tipped tongs, metal, bone, or wooden probes, hooks, small knives, or even their fingers to locate the tips, but the lack of anesthesia, the procedure's crudeness, the risk of breaking the arrow and leaving fragments inside, or the chance of tearing tissues, organs, or blood vessels meant many soldiers preferred to risk leaving it in rather than endure the extraction, which could cause more damage than the original wound. In some cases, surgeons resorted to extreme techniques, like pushing the arrow through the body to extract it from the other side, a method that, while theoretically effective, often caused massive bleeding, infections, or irreversible damage to vital organs like the liver, lungs, stomach, or heart. Crossbow wounds were even more lethal, as bolts, fired with enough force to pierce chainmail, helms, wooden shields, or armor plates, could shatter bones, lodge deeply, pass through the body leaving entry and exit wounds, or even fragment inside, making extraction nearly impossible without causing fatal bleeding or devastating infection. Maces, war hammers, flails, clubs, and other blunt weapons caused less visible but equally devastating injuries. An open fracture, where the bone pierced the skin, was almost a death sentence, as exposure to air, mud, dirt, flies, bacteria, and debris invited gangrene. That putrid infection that devoured flesh, turned skin black, caused devastating fevers, swelling, foul-smelling pus, and an odor so unbearable it could nauseate even the hardiest. Simple fractures, though less lethal, were rarely treated properly. Without modern casts, metal plates, or advanced immobilization techniques, bones healed crookedly, leaving soldiers with permanent limps, useless arms, hunched backs, misaligned hips, jaws that never worked right, or deformed skulls causing chronic headaches, dizziness, or vision loss. In some cases, surgeons tried to manually align bones, using makeshift splints of wood, leather, branches, bark, armor fragments, lance shafts, or even broken cart planks, tied with ropes, cloth strips, leather straps, or bandages. But this procedure was so painful that many patients fainted, screamed until voiceless, suffered seizures, or died of shock during the process. Internal bruises, like those from a mace blow to the torso, a horse's impact, a fall from a siege ladder or wall, an overturned cart, or even a punch or kick in hand-to-hand combat, were even harder to treat, as damage to vital organs. Liver, kidneys, lungs, spleen, stomach, intestines, or heart was invisible, and medieval physicians lacked the tools, knowledge, or techniques to diagnose or treat them, leaving the patient to the mercy of nature, luck, their body's resilience, or divine providence. Pain was an inseparable companion for the wounded, a constant presence that could last hours, days, weeks, or even a lifetime. Without modern analgesics, soldiers relied on remedies like opium, which was rare, expensive, hard to obtain, and reserved almost exclusively for the wealthy, nobles, high-ranking commanders, important clerics, or military leaders, or alcohol like wine, beer, mead, cider, or brandy, which was more accessible but not always sufficient, especially for deep wounds, amputations, cauterizations, arrow extractions, or bone realignments. Some sources mention the use of mandrake, henbane, hemlock, poppy, valerian, angelica, elderberry, basil, thyme, mint, rosemary, willow bark, wild plant roots, or even hallucinogenic mushrooms, plants with narcotic, sedative, or analgesic properties administered in infusions, poultices, chewed directly, burned for inhalation, mixed with honey, wine, beer, animal fat, or resin, or applied directly to the wound. However, their use was a dangerous game. A miscalculated dose could lead to coma, paralysis, intense hallucinations, seizures, poisoning, or death, and battlefield surgeons, apothecaries, monks, healers, or clerics, with little or no knowledge of pharmacology, often improvised with disastrous results. Soldiers dying of poisoning, falling into a sleep from which they never woke, suffering delusions that led them to harm themselves or others, or becoming addicted to substances like opium or mandrake, if they survived long enough. In many cases, the only analgesic was fainting from extreme pain, blood loss, exhaustion, shock, or fever. It's no surprise that some soldiers, seeing the surgeon saw approaching, feeling the cold metal of tongs in their flesh, smelling the red-hot iron to be used for cauterization, hearing the screams of other patients, or imagining the pain of an operation with no guarantee of success, begged for a quick death, by their own hand, a merciful comrade's or an enemy's, preferring the certainty of a swift end to the uncertainty of prolonged suffering, a slow infection, or a life of disability. The logistics of evacuating the wounded was another monumental challenge, a puzzle of organization, resources, and brute strength in a world without ambulances, paved roads, modern hospitals, triage systems, or motorized vehicles. Transporting a wounded man could be as lethal as the wound itself, as movement aggravated pain, fractures, bleeding, and infections. Ox dash, mule dash, horse dash, or even man-drawn carts were the most common, but the jolting of a bumpy, stone-strewn, root-riddled, muddy, snowy, or sandy path turned the journey into agony for someone with a fracture, an open wound, a burn, an embedded arrow, or internal bleeding. More organized armies, like those of the Crusades, the Byzantine Empire, or wealthy kings like Philip Augustus of France, Richard the Lionheart, Henry V of England, Alfonso VIII of Castile, Frederick Barbarossa, Saladin, or Mongol Khans, might have makeshift stretchers made from branches, cloth, leather, blankets, cloaks, torn-off doors, wooden planks, broken shields, or even disassembled armor, or litters carried by soldiers, servants, slaves, or prisoners. But this was a luxury reserved for nobles, high-ranking knights, important clerics, commanders, or wealthy pilgrims. Common soldiers, if lucky, were carried on their comrades' shoulders, often at the cost of exhausting physical effort that put the rescuers at risk of attack from enemies, looters, bandits, wild animals, or simply collapsing under the weight of a man, his armor, his weapons, and battle fatigue. In many cases, the wounded were transported in overcrowded carts alongside other soldiers, weapons, supplies, loot, or even corpses, increasing the risk of infection and making the journey even more unbearable. It was not uncommon for a retreating army to abandon its wounded to avoid slowing the march, especially if the enemy was close, supplies were scarce, horses were exhausted, carts were broken, or the terrain was difficult. Deserts of the Holy Land, dense forests of Germania, swamps of Flanders, mountains of the Pyrenees, Alps, Carpathians, or Balkans, steppes of Eastern Europe, or flooded plains of England. In the most chaotic battles, like Agincourt, 1415, the wounded could be left behind, trapped in mud, crushed by their own 30 or 40-kilo armor, suffocated in mire, devoured by scavenging animals, finished off by enemies, or simply forgotten in a field that became an anonymous grave. In the Crusades, wounded men abandoned in the desert faced not only looters but also dehydration, scorching heat, sandstorms that could bury them alive, freezing nights that brought hypothermia, or attacks from hyenas, jackals, or vultures. Food and water, essential for recovery, were another critical issue, a logistical challenge that could mean the difference between life and death. In a military camp, provisions were often scarce, especially after a prolonged battle, a long siege, or a campaign in distant lands, and the wounded were not the priority when distributing them. A diet of stale, often moldy or weevil-ridden bread, overly salted dried meat, watery gruel, rotten turnips, onions, lentils, chickpeas, beans, peas, cabbages, wild roots, bitter herbs, or even scraps stolen from villagers was hardly ideal for healing a body weakened by trauma, blood loss, fever, or infection. Malnutrition was a constant threat, as a starving body was less likely to fight infections, heal wounds, or regain strength, making even a minor injury potentially fatal by compromising an already weakened immune system battered by pain, shock, cold, heat, or disease. Wealthier armies, like those of French, English, Castilian, Aragonese kings, Muslim sultans, Byzantine emperors, or crusader leaders, could afford fresh fruits, apples, pears, figs, pomegranates, grapes, quinces, or citrus, better quality meat, lamb, chicken, rabbit, or pork, cheese, butter, honey, milk, quality wine, decent beer, mead, cider, or even spices like saffron, cloves, cinnamon, ginger, or pepper for nobles, knights, and commanders. But this was an exception reserved for the elite, not the common foot soldier, archer, lancer, or recruited peasant. In many cases, the wounded relied on the charity of locals, who might offer bread, cheese, turnips, onions, lentils, chickpeas, soup, broth, sour milk, eggs, foraged wild fruits, berries, mushrooms, roots, or herbs, or on alms from monasteries, convents, churches, or hospices, which were often so overwhelmed they could barely provide a bowl of watery soup, a crust of moldy bread, a bitter herbal infusion, a piece of rancid cheese, or a handful of legumes boiled in murky water. In winter, cold exacerbated the situation, as the wounded, weakened and without dry clothing, blankets, coats, proper boots, gloves, or a nearby fire, could succumb to hypothermia before their wounds killed them, especially in northern regions like Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Germany, Scandinavia, Slavic lands, Baltic regions, Russian steppes, or Polish territories, where temperatures could drop below freezing, winds cut like knives, and snow covered paths, camps, and bodies. In summer, excessive heat, especially in the Holy Land, southern Spain, Sicily, North Africa, Greece, Anatolia, or Hungarian plains, could dehydrate the wounded, worsen fevers, hasten wound rot, attract more flies, mosquitoes, and other insects that laid eggs in exposed flesh, and cause heat stroke that killed as swiftly as a sword, lance, arrow, or infection, leaving the wounded delirious, sweating, with burned skin and a heart on the brink of collapse. And if you want to dive deeper into this topic, I've linked a book in the description that explores it further. The psychological impact of wounds was also profound, though the Middle Ages had no clear concept of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, or psychological trauma. A soldier who survived a battle could be scarred by the experience. The horror of seeing comrades torn apart by a cavalry charge, decapitated by an axe, crushed by a horse, burned alive in a siege, pierced by arrows or bolts, drowned in mud, disemboweled by a lance, or mutilated by a mace. The constant fear of death, which could come at any moment from a stray arrow, an unexpected blow, an infection, a disease, or a mercy killing on the field. The unbearable pain of a poorly treated wound that could linger for weeks or months. The trauma of killing another man up close, looking into his eyes as life faded, feeling his blood on their hands, or hearing his final screams. The guilt of surviving while others perished, leaving behind friends, brothers, cousins, or village comrades, or the terror of being crippled in a world with no place for the weak, disabled, or those unable to work, fight, or support a family. These traumas manifested in nightmares, tremors, insomnia, hallucinations, uncontrollable weeping, screams in the night, cold sweats, loss of appetite, apathy, aggression, paranoia, or a deep melancholy that some interpreted as weakness, cowardice, madness, demonic possession, or divine punishment. Medieval society offered no therapy, psychology, or emotional support. Instead, traumatized soldiers were urged to pray, confess, do penance, fast, donate to the church, go on pilgrimage, self-flagellate, or seek absolution for their sins, which were often seen as the cause of their suffering. Whether for killing, stealing, swearing in vain, doubting the faith, abandoning a comrade, or surviving when others did not. In extreme cases, a priest, monk, or cleric might attempt an exorcism, believing the soldier was possessed by an evil spirit, that his wounds were the result of a curse, that his troubled mind was the devil's work, or that his nightmares were infernal visions. These practices, far from helping, could deepen the anguish of a man already burdened by the weight of war, trapped in a cycle of guilt, fear, pain, despair, and isolation without tools, knowledge, or support to cope. Some soldiers, unable to bear the trauma, deserted, fleeing to forests, mountains, coasts, cities, or swamps, living as outlaws, bandits, hermits, beggars, or pilgrims, while others sought refuge in monasteries, convents, hermitages, or religious communities, where a contemplative life, prayers, silence, manual labor, or manuscript copying could offer some peace, though often at the cost of abandoning their families, honor, identity, or place in the world. The fate of the wounded also varied by the battle's context, region, nature of the conflict, political circumstances, religion, and cultural dynamics. In a local war, like the frequent feudal disputes in France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, Italian city-states like Florence, Venice, or Genoa, Iberian kingdoms during the Reconquista, or Celtic lands of Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, a wounded soldier might hope to be rescued by his community, family, feudal lord, village comrades, or even enemies, if they offered mercy in exchange for ransom, loyalty, or information. Peasant families, though poor, often cared for their wounded, using homemade remedies like herbal poultices, nettle, dandelion, yarrow, rosemary, chamomile, garlic, ivy, valerian, angelica, elderberry, basil, thyme, bay laurel, mint, parsley, moss, roots, bark, or flowers, bandages made from old linen, rags, leather, tree bark, moss, wool, or even large leaves, and prayers, amulets, relics, or rituals to invoke divine protection, such as praying to Sts Cosmas and Damian, Saint Margaret, St. Roch, Saint Sebastian, Saint Christopher, Saint George, the Virgin Mary, or a local saint, or carrying a reliquary with a cross, bone fragment, sacred cloth, or engraved stone. In the Crusades, however, a wounded soldier in the Holy Land, Anatolia, North Africa, Syria, Palestine, or Egypt was thousands of miles from home. In a hostile environment where help was scarce, language was a barrier, resources were limited, and the climate, scorching desert heat, torrential highland rains, sandstorms, freezing nights, or abrasive winds could worsen wounds, cause dehydration, hypothermia, fever, or infections. Crusader armies had field hospitals, especially those run by military orders like the Hospitallers, Templars, Knights of St. Lazarus, Teutonic Knights, or Monks of St. John. But these were overwhelmed, poorly equipped, understaffed, and prioritized knights, officers, clerics, wealthy pilgrims, or military leaders, leaving common soldiers, mercenaries, archers, or recruited peasants to fend for themselves, often treated by local healers, wandering monks, nearby village women, or even captured Muslim physicians, who sometimes offered their services for freedom or payment. Wounded prisoners faced an even grimmer fate. A captured noble could hope for ransom paid in gold, silver, land, castles, political favors, hostages, relics, or even arranged marriages, but a wounded common soldier was more likely to be executed, enslaved, abandoned, tortured for information, used as a bargaining chip, or even sacrificed in rituals, especially in regions where local customs or religious beliefs permitted it, like among some nomadic tribes or in the early Crusades, where mercy was scarce. In some cases, wounded prisoners were used as forced labor, compelled to build fortifications, dig trenches, carry supplies, or serve as human shields in the next siege, despite their wounds, pain, and weakness. Death was, undoubtedly, the most common outcome for the wounded, a fate lurking in every wound, infection, cold night, or day without food or water. Though precise statistics are absent, historians estimate that 20% to 60% of wounded soldiers died in the hours, days, weeks, or months following a battle, from infections, gangrene, septicemia, tetanus, erysipelas, bleeding, external or internal, internal complications, damage to vital organs like the liver, lungs, heart, spleen, or kidneys, malnutrition, dehydration, hypothermia, heatstroke, diseases like dysentery, typhus, cholera, plague, malaria, typhoid fever, or skin infections, or simply abandonment on the field, in a camp, on a road, or in a village. Survivors often faced disability, which in an agrarian, military, and feudal society meant a life of poverty, begging, menial labor, social ostracism, or dependence on charity. Some cities, guilds, feudal lords, churches, or communities offered aid to wounded veterans, small pensions, lodging in hospices, hospitals, or monasteries, light work, like guarding a gate, cleaning a church, tending livestock, sewing clothes, copying manuscripts, teaching children, or helping in a workshop, tax exemptions, donations of food, clothing, or tools, or even small plots of land to farm. But this aid was limited, unsystematic, often reserved for those with connections. A distinguished military past, the protection of a noble, cleric, or guild, or a story that inspired pity, like fighting in a crusade or defending a city. Monasteries, convents, churches, hospices, and religious hospitals could take in some cripples, but only if they had the resources, which was not always the case, especially in times of prolonged war, famine, plague, floods, droughts, fires, peasant revolts, invasions, or economic crises that depleted the resources of religious communities, villages, cities, and castles. Despite this bleak picture, there were stories of resilience that defied the odds, small human miracles shining in the darkness. Some soldiers, against all probability, recovered from severe wounds, deep cuts that healed with thick scars, fractures that fused crookedly but functionally, burns that left marks but no infections, arrows extracted without causing fatal bleeding, and returned to their lives, either on the battlefield as hardened mercenaries who learned to wield a sword with their remaining hand, shoot a bow with one eye, ride with a makeshift wooden, leather, metal, or bone prosthetic leg, or lead with scars that told tales of survival, or as instructors, blacksmiths, armorers, or storytellers in taverns, markets, or squares, or in their villages, resuming the plow with a crutch, limping after a horse, milking cows with one arm, weaving with crooked fingers, working as craftsmen with the skills they still had, or telling stories to children for a crust of bread, a sip of beer, or a coin. These recoveries were often attributed to miracles, the intervention of a saint, divine will, luck, or the strength of the human spirit, and it was not uncommon for survivors to vow pilgrimages to shrines like San Juan de Ortega in Spain, St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury, St. Peter in Rome, the Holy Cross in Jerusalem, Santiago de Compostela, St. Michael at Monte Gargano, St. Nicholas in Bari, St. Andrew in Scotland, St. Catherine in Sinai, or St. Anthony in Padua, dragging their battered bodies through dusty, muddy, bandit-infested, snow-blocked, sun-scorched, flood-soaked, or war-torn roads to give thanks for their survival, fulfill a vow, seek absolution for their sins, pray for their family's protection, or atone for the guilt of having killed or survived. Relics, amulets, prayers, medals, rosaries, crosses, runes, talismans, and sacred images were constant companions of the wounded, offering psychological comfort that the medicine of the time could not, an anchor of hope in a world where death lurked at every corner, where physical and emotional pain was as ever-present as the sound of church bells, the smell of dung, the taste of moldy bread, the feel of cold mud, or the clash of swords. In a world where life was fragile, death a certainty, and hope an act of faith, faith was often the only refuge for those bearing the weight of a war that spared no one, a world where suffering was a currency, compassion a luxury, and survival a miracle. If this narrative has gripped you and you want to keep exploring life in the Middle Ages, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the button and join for more stories that transport you to another era. And if you want to learn more about this topic, I've linked a book in the description that dives deeper.